understand you by and by.
Thank you, Curtis Mayfield, and thank you for the ongoing inspiration, because moving on up is what it's all about. We got a long way to go. And our next guest is Aaron Cohen. He is the author of Move On Up, Chicago Soul Music and Black Cultural Power. Good morning to you, brother.
Good morning to you, brother, and thank you so much for having me on here. This is a great show, and I'm really happy to be a part of it today.
How's it
Well,
going,
we
Aaron?
love people who say it's a great show, because it's always good to hear, and I want to thank James Porter for putting it in our ear that you would be a great guest, and he went after you.
He's always coming after me.
He got you. You guys have a little history, right?
Yeah, let's not go
not
into
all
that.
positive.
None at all?
No.
James is laughing in the back there.
He's an old friend of mine. It's all good. It's all good.
So let's start out with your new book, Move On Up, Chicago Soul Music and Black Cultural Power. How did you end up choosing the title of that book?
Well, as we just heard from the Curtis Mayfield song, it's such an inspirational song that how could I go wrong with a Curtis Mayfield title, for the title track of the book. And the book is about how social and cultural changes shaped the music in Chicago, and how the musicians themselves became change agents. I see here on the wall, don't adapt to absurdity, resist. And that's what the musicians in Chicago did, is they resisted a lot of the absurdity that faced Chicago, that faced the nation. And Curtis Mayfield ran throughout it all as a musician, as a composer, as a singer, as a guitarist, as an entrepreneur, and as someone who was also a contributor to the political changes that were going on in Chicago and in the country during the time that I wrote. The main part of the book is from the late 1950s to the early 1980s, and Curtis Mayfield's work ran throughout it. So I felt it was very important to use a Curtis Mayfield title, and it was either Move On Up or We're a Winner, and I chose Move On Up.
They both would be great.
Yeah, so I used We're a Winner for a chapter title.
And Curtis, when you open the book, you talk a bunch about the Impressions.
Yes.
So that's a group that Curtis was involved with.
Yes.
And we had a guest from the Impressions, the late great Reggie Torian.
Wonderful man.
Came on later in the Impressions.
He joined after Curtis.
But tell us a little bit about the Impressions and how you opened that book and why you chose them to open the book.
Well, the Impressions at the time they started recording were a group of teenagers who were based in the Cabrini Green housing development, which is not far from where we're sitting right now. And I wanted to talk about their first single that became big, which was For Your Precious Love, with Jerry Butler on lead vocals, and Curtis Mayfield was in the background at that time as a guitarist, and the other singers in the group and their manager Eddie Thomas, who Lynn and I both know, and the whole journey of them going from Cabrini Green, not far from here, to Record Row, which was the epicenter of Chicago record production at that time, and all of the forces that made that moment happen. Growing up in the housing projects, what that was like in terms of their musical training, and going to Record Row, what were all the circumstances that created this street where there were all of these small record labels. Some of them, like VJ, which is who they recorded that song for, was owned by African Americans. And then also, what was the media at that time to get a song like that out on the air? What made it more available for African American radio stations to play that song and make it popular? So I wanted to have the first chapter open with this sort of crystallization of a bunch of different forces that made this song happen. Granted, it was the singers and the musicians who were primary importance in that song, but it didn't happen in a vacuum, and I wanted to talk about that community surrounding the song as much as the song itself.
Aaron Cohen, what led you to do this book? Your interest in music, I think your dad is a historian.
Yes, my dad.
How did you end up delving into the black community and this important book that you have put out?
Well, not only was my dad a historian of colonial American history, Sheldon Cohen, if you're listening, he's my dad. He taught here at Loyola, And so that makes me being here at Loyola University so much more important, because throughout from 1969 until the mid-1990s, this very campus is where my dad taught. He also taught at the Rogers Park campus as well. He taught history. And part of what my dad accomplished as a historian was looking at a lot of stories that were not being told. My dad focused on colonial American history, and my dad felt that there were so many stories that were told about George Washington, Ben Franklin, etc. My dad wanted to research and describe other stories from that era that were not being told as much, and that really imparted on me the need to tell stories that I felt it was important to fill a gap. And when I was a young person, listening to records quite avidly and listening to all kinds of music, jazz, R&B, rock, blues, and that classical music and folk music from my parents. And I was also reading a lot about music. And a book that came out when I was a teenager that struck me, and also struck James Porter, who's there in the back, was Peter Guralnick's book, Sweet Soul Music. And that was a book that looked at mostly Southern soul music, and how it intertwined with the civil rights movement. And it was such a well-written book, such incredible research and interviews, and he told the story so well, it made a big impact on me as a young person. And I thought, it's important that someone should do a book about Chicago soul music, and how, because as much as the South was important to the civil rights movement, and as much as Southern soul music was a part of that, the same thing could be said about Chicago. Chicago was just as crucial, and the music from Chicago was just as crucial. So I wanted to think that someone should tie this together.
Well, I have a question about that.
I go to college.
Now you mention it.
In 1990 was when Curtis Mayfield was badly injured from an onstage freak accident in Brooklyn. And that, of course, made me think more about Curtis Mayfield, his life, his career, his contribution. And then in 1991, Robert Pruder's book, Chicago Soul, came out. And that was a really great reference to all of these different artists. And so I'm moving back to Chicago after college, and I'm starting to think more about the traditions that come here from Chicago. And I still felt that there needed to be a book describing the political, social, cultural changes and music, because that was not Robert Pruder's focus. And there were also other musicians who I wanted to focus on, who I learned about in the 1990s, like Terry Collier and the Rotary Connection and Baby Huey and the Babysitters, because they were important too. So that's a very long-winded answer to your short, direct question about how I wrote a book.
James is in there, yearning to ask a question.
I didn't mean to step over Aaron. I
don't have headphones on, so you're going to have to.
Oh, he doesn't have headphones on.
Excuse me. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm not sure how to do
Okay.
this.
So
wait till he puts
Another
the
set of
phones on.
headphones, Lynn. And we'll ask you a question in a minute on that.
James can. I'll answer James's question later.
I'm going to ask you though.
Let's not prioritize
How
James.
how do you define soul music, and who gets to be in on that? I mean, Sam Cooke, who actually had he owned a recording studio too, as I understand. You mentioned VJ, but I think...
Well, Sam Cooke's label, SAR, was based in Los Angeles.
Oh, okay.
And he was from here.
Yeah, I know.
He grew up in what's now Bronzeville area. But he also, with Sam Cooke, I'm going to answer your question, but just a little thing about Sam Cooke. So the difference with Sam Cooke was he started his label, SAR, after he was established, after he was a star. Whereas here in Chicago, people like Curtis Mayfield were starting up their operations before starting.
Yeah, early on.
When they were young.
Pioneers.
Yeah, young people following Sam Cooke's
lead. And VJ
lead.
was a black-owned label, as you pointed
Yes.
out. There were other ones?
Well, they were the big one. There was also Wonderful, ONE-Derful, and there were others as well. VJ had the most impact. But to get back to your question about what is soul is, along with writing this book and along with my passion for soul music, I also write about jazz music, and I was an editor at Downbeat, the jazz magazine. And in both, as a soul writer, scholar, and as a jazz journalist, I like to keep these boundaries as open as possible. So when you ask me what is soul, my definition is so different than everybody else's, because some people are more hardcore. Some people are more like, well, it has to have this backbeat, it has to have this call and response, it has to derive from, Pentecostal or Baptist gospel this way, and all of that is true. those are all roots and all musical qualities. But to me, a soul singer, Terry Collier, who oftentimes played with just an acoustic guitar, a couple bassists, a percussionist, drew from folk music, as we like to think of it, as well as soul music. The Shylights, who are certainly a soul group, as I talk about in my book, their harmonies came from their background in the Catholic Church. There were other soul groups like Rotary Connection, who drew from rock, and their producer, Charles Stepney, brought in classical music arrangements from chamber, and that was all soul music. And that's true everywhere. So again, I'd like to keep a very open definition as to Stevie Wonder. His whole career sounded different from day one to today, and it was all soul music. There's no denying that. So it's a very open question that I'm not answering.
Did Sam Cooke get in the soul music category, or is he in?
Of course.
Yeah,
of course.
But not a Luther Allison.
Well, that's the funny thing, I didn't really include Luther Allison because he's more considered a blues artist. Because also with blues, we have, and again, I like to also keep that definition as open as possible. I know how to divide
my record collection.
Yeah. Well, of course, a lot of these genre categories came about because people wanted to sell records as opposed to like how people actually, appreciate music.
I think, do we have our technical stuff set up so that James Porter can...
Okay, let me hear what James...
What
does James Porter have to say here?
Can you hear me there, son?
A little bit. I can hear a little bit.
Okay. Got the volume turned up to the past the threshold of pain, so you should hear me. The thing about Chicago being underrated as a soul center, it's like... Can you hear me, Aaron?
No, I really can't.
Oh, my God. Okay.
Keep working on it. We'll do that. Let's talk about other influences in Chicago.
Sure.
Let's talk about a little bit about people like Phil Coran, let's say. Phil was a guy I got to know because he came in the HeartLand Cafe regularly. He had been involved with some really experimental music.
Absolutely.
He'd been involved putting on concerts at Cook County Jail.
Yes.
Tell a little bit about Phil, who recently passed away.
At age 90, yeah. Wonderful, wonderful man who I spent a long time with. Well, he was, doing so many things throughout his long life, from working with the great Sun Ra to experimenting with his take on classical music and his take on African music. And he invented an instrument called the francophone, named after his mother, which was loosely based on a Southern African mbira.
I always thought it was a thumb piano. That's
another name for it. But I mean, the Southern African term is mbira, but essentially, the thumb piano. And he ran the Afro Arts Theater in the late 1960s. Now, the Afro Arts Theater was a great cultural institution where he was teaching and showing young people in the neighborhood about African culture, about the connections between the South Side that they were living in and ancient Africa. And he would be on stage playing the thumb piano, francophone, mbira, whatever you want to call it. Now, who were the young people who would go to the Afro Arts Theater? People like Maurice White, who was playing drums for Ramsey Lewis at sessions at Chess. And Maurice White goes to the Afro Arts Theater on the South Side, and he's turned on to this whole new music. And Maurice White brings, his take on the mbira thumb piano to Earth, Wind, and Fire. Who's another teenager who goes to the Afro Arts Theater? A singer named Yvette Stevens. Yvette Stevens goes to the Afro Arts Theater, and she gets turned on to African culture. She takes the name Shaka. Later, she marries someone named Khan. She becomes Shaka Khan. Shaka Khan grew up in the Afro Arts Theater. So did her sister, who became the funk singer Taka Boom. So it was a way of turning these very young people onto this culture and onto this music. And some of them, those two, Maurice White and Shaka Khan, took it to, great international acclaim. And then there were other groups too, like the Pharaohs, who were a great R&B funk group, and members of that group actually went on to join Earth, Wind, and Fire as well. Louis Satterfield, Don Myrick, people like that. So it was a focal point. And also political speakers would come to the Afro Arts Theater, people like Fred Hampton, people like Stokely Carmichael. So they would also turn on the political consciousness alongside this innovative music.
There's another guy I want to ask about. and that would be Gene Barge.
Sure, wonderful Gene
Barge. I got to know Gene working in films, Andy Davis films, Stony Island, Above the Law, Code of Silence. All of these films were both part of Andy's troupe of guys.
Andy Davis.
Andy Davis, who
Yes.
you did talk to.
I did. I talked to
And I
Andy.
hope Andy's listening out there. And,
We should talk about Stony Island later, but let's also talk about Gene Barge.
well, we're only gonna have 10 more minutes.
Uh-oh. We
And
can
then
talk all day.
So let's give us a little bit on Gene Barge.
Okay, well, Gene Barge, as he's known, Daddy G, is a saxophonist, and he was doing sessions at Chess Records for a lot of great records. But he was also an activist with Operation Breadbasket, and is still to this day very close with the Operation Push organization. So, he was someone who brought in music, political activism, and he also presented this role on screen in Stony Island, a film from the 1970s that portrayed the idealism of an integrated R&B band in Chicago and what the possibilities were for that.
In that movie, I play the mean old Uncle Roy, a southern guy, a hillbilly dude, and I am it's hard for me to watch because I end up smashing the saxophone of
Spoiler alert.
of my nephew George, who is the guy they recruit to play the saxophone, and it's painful. We've got
Okay, now I can hear James.
we've got James back on. So James, you had a question you wanted to throw out.
Yes, I do. Can you hear me now, Aaron?
I can hear you
Yes.
now, James.
Okay, cool. Yes. Now, I always thought that one reason why Chicago soul has been underrated is because when you think of Memphis soul, you think of Stax. When you think of Detroit soul, you think of Motown. But with Chicago soul, the labels are all spread out. It's kind of like Eugene Record once said from Charlotte. He said something about how because there were so many labels, people know the hits, but they don't know they all came from here or from the same place. Do you think that might be a factor?
I think it is a factor. How much of a factor it is, I can only speculate, because one of the other things, too, about Motown in Detroit and Stax in Memphis is that, especially in the last 15 years, both Detroit and Memphis have really gotten behind those stories. And you can go to Detroit and go to the Motown Museum, and it's wonderful. And you can go to Memphis and not only see the museum connected with Stax, but also a really great high school, a charter school connected with Stax Records. And Chicago itself has not gotten behind these institutions the way Detroit and Memphis have gotten behind.
We have
their
2120
institutions.
South Michigan, but they kind of seem to be focused on the blues over everything else.
There's that, and there could be so much more than that. And
That's Chess Records for those who don't know.
yes, Chess
Yes.
Records, and but there could be so much more in Chicago, and I think that with those major labels that you mentioned, Chess and Stax, come institutional support, and with institutional support comes municipal support, and that's one of the factors. I mean, there are other factors as well, but I do think you're definitely right in mentioning that.
One of the things that I noted in the parts of your book that I got to read so far was you talked about the difference and then I think the influence of the West Side versus the South Side. And on the West Side, there was a lack of institutional development and places for people to play, to practice. Just talk a little bit about that dichotomy of the difference and how both parts of the city played into the soul scene.
Well, there certainly was that dichotomy, a dichotomy that exists to this day, as
Yeah.
we all know, between the South and West Sides. I mean, the South Side had so many of these institutions, whether it was the Regal Theater in the 50s and 60s.
I
It
remember
had-
the Regal, going to the Regal in the old days.
Oh, I got to get you to
I
talk
saw
about
Ola
that.
Tunji there.
Oh, wow.
And, Joe
amazing.
Williams and I think Big Mama Thornton.
Wow.
This would have been in the early 60s sometime.
And the Chicago Defender newspaper, based on the South Side. Ebony and Jet, based on the South Side. Record Row, kind of South. West Side didn't have that. But, I mean, the West Side, people who grew up on the West Side, like Gavin Christopher, who I interviewed, who Lynn got to know very well, they made institutions themselves. Yes, Lynn interviewed him right here in the studio. So the people who grew up on the West Side oftentimes made their own way, their own institutions, whether it was people like Gavin Christopher leaning on the fence to listen in on the blues clubs that were there, or people going to the high schools like Marshall High School, Crane High School, and taking what they could from the institutions that did exist on the West Side. So while the South Side had more of these cultural, and I of course talk about the Afro Arts Theater, which is on the South Side, but the people on the West Side were not totally bereft of some institutions that they could use to their advantage. And again, a lot of times it was having to make it on their own through the public high schools that were there.
You are an author who has done a lot of writing, and one of the things that you did do before this book came out, where did my book go? Someone's got it right there. Before you did Moving On Up, you did a book on Aretha Franklin called Amazing Grace, I believe?
That was a book about her Amazing Grace album, and the book came out in 2011. And, well, that was the same thing, because so much had been written about Aretha Franklin, but not as much had been written about that particular album. And I remember at the time, Aretha Franklin was on the cover of Rolling Stone as one of the best, as the best singer of the 20th century, which I agree. But that accompanying article did not mention the Amazing Grace album once. And this was her best-selling
Isn't
album.
there a documentary on this movie? Is that
We're getting to that.
Okay,
We're getting to that. The article didn't mention the Amazing Grace album once. So I wanted to do a book about the album and its importance as a work of art, as its cultural impact. The film came out recently. The film came out in 2018. It had been worked on, and they were working on the film, producing it. I mean, the film was filmed when the album was made in 1972. It was a live document. And the film, which everybody should see, it's a wonderful film.
Yeah, I hear it is.
Aretha Franklin performing in the church, and that's it. There's no interviews, no talking heads, which is great because you don't want people talking when you can see Aretha Franklin singing. So my book is all of the context. My book provides, on Amazing Grace, provides all of that information that interviews would provide. So you can watch the film now that you can see the film, you can listen to the album, and then you can read the book, which has all of the backstory, all of the wider context.
I got to tell people that I got to see Aretha Franklin when she was 18 in 1962 at the Village Vanguard.
Wow.
Going way back.
Now, who was she? She was performing at the Village Vanguard with some really well-known jazz people.
I don't remember. Okay. I had gone up to the Newport Jazz Festival with Don Law, the son of Don Law, the producer from Columbia,
Right.
I think.
Wow.
And I met some A&R guys from Columbia, and I remember being at the club with them. I just remember this young, very lean woman at that time really kicking it out, and loved her ever since. So what are you working on now, Aaron?
Well,
what do you got? What's next coming from your prolific stance in the world here?
I'm teaching now at City Colleges of Chicago.
Ah, great.
And I want to focus on teaching, focus on education. So that's my main focus now. And, it's funny because I have a lot of ideas for books that other people should write. So maybe I'm really an editor at heart. But right now I'm focused on teaching. I'm focused on promoting this book. And I'm working on articles too. I'm writing articles always.
Well, we've got a couple of things we're going to mention about where you're going to be talking about your book.
Yes.
And then I think Lynn is going to fill us in on our next move here this morning. You are listening to Live from the Heartland on WLUW 88.7 Chicago Sound Alliance, available anywhere in the world at WLUW.org. And you can listen to earlier editions of the show or see earlier editions of this show at youtube.com/heartlandmedia or livefromtheheartland.com. So, Aaron Cohen, the author of this wonderful book, is going to be at the Seminary Co-op in Chicago at 6 o'clock on October 10th. On October 11th, he's going to be at that wonderful Constellation Room over there on Western Avenue. And
That's at 8:30, and I'll be DJing.
Ooh.
Woohoo. With James?
With Steve Marquette, a great jazz guitarist. We're going to be DJing together.
Oh, we should go to that one. And then on October 24th, you're going to be at the Bookseller
In Lincoln Square.
at
Lovely store.
7:30. And
7 o'clock. 7
then you're
o'clock.
heading to Iowa at the Prairie Lights, which our pal Russ Bradberg, I
Yes.
saw him at City Lights. We were traveling around. And then you're going to Milwaukee on November 2nd, and then you go to L.A. and San Francisco. We won't deal with that. So I want to say it's been an honor to have you on
It's
the
been
show.
wonderful. It's been an honor to be on the show.
I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the book.
Thanks.
I had read Mark Kurlansky's Ready for a Brand New Beat,
That's
which
a great book.
hit me to Detroit. This is closer to home, and the names are even more familiar. We want to thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having
Nice,
me.
Aaron.
Great to be here. Thank you,
So
James.
excited to have
Thank
you.
And
you,
now
Lynn.
we got
Finally.
Lynn
Thanks,
Orman
Lynn.
going to tell us our next move here on the Live from the Heartland
We're-
show on the 5th of October in the great year of 2019.
Right, and what a great opportunity for us to have two of my favorite people in studio today, Aaron. Thank you. And up next, they call him a national treasure. It is his birthday month. We're so happy to celebrate with the great harp player, keyboard player, arranger, composer, spiritual guru. That would be
Activist.
activist. That would be Corky Siegel. And we're going to come in right now, James. You're tuning up our Counterintuitive,
Here I
Opus
am.
24, Part 1, from Corky Siegel's Chamber Blues, Different Voices.
Love you.